The whistle of the locomotive was a mournful sound, a thin blade of steam and noise cutting through the heavy, falling snow. Caleb Thorne stood on the platform of the Frost Creek station, his collar turned up against a wind that felt personal in its cruelty. He wasn't a man given to waiting. His life had been a series of movements, of leaving places before they could hold him. But today, he was anchored to this spot by a debt he couldn't pay and a threat he couldn't outrun. Jedediah Croft, who owned the bank, the saloon, and nearly every soul in Frost Creek, had made the terms brutally clear. "You owe me, Thorne," Croft had said, his voice smooth as polished stone in the quiet of his office 2 weeks prior. "That misunderstanding in Wyoming with the cattle baron's son. A word from me to the right U.S. Marshal, and you'll swing before the spring thaw. Or you can settle your account with me in a different way." The settlement was a marriage, a cruel public joke designed to break the last of Caleb's pride. Croft had arranged for a bride to be sent from San Francisco, sight unseen. "A mail-order bride, to make you a respectable, settled man," Croft had sneered, the lie thick in the air. Caleb knew the truth. This wasn't about respectability. It was about humiliation. Croft wanted to tether the gunslinger, the man who lived by his own code, to something he couldn't fight or flee. He wanted to make him a laughingstock. The train hissed to a stop, its iron wheels grinding against the frozen tracks. A few freight cars were unloaded by shivering workers, their breath pluming in the frigid air. Then the door of the single-passenger car opened. A small figure appeared, hesitating in the doorway. She descended the steps carefully, clutching a worn, dark suitcase. The wind caught the edges of her dress, a tattered thing of dark green wool, and whipped it around her thin frame. She was young, barely a woman, and her face was a pale oval against the storm. She looked around, lost and utterly alone, before making her way to a wooden bench under the station's meager overhang. She sat, pulling her suitcase close to her feet, and huddled into herself, a small knot of misery against the vast white emptiness of Montana in winter. The few townspeople who had braved the weather to watch the spectacle began to murmur. Caleb heard a low chuckle from behind him. It was 2 of Croft's men, their smirks visible even from a distance. The joke had arrived. This was the punchline. A frightened Chinese girl sent across the country to be the wife of the man they all feared, a woman so foreign and out of place that her very presence was an insult. Caleb watched her. She had her head bowed, and he could see her shoulders trembling. She was crying. Not loudly, but with the silent, desperate shudders of someone who had run out of hope. The laughter of Croft's men grated on him, a file against raw nerve. He had expected to feel anger, resentment, the cold fury that was his constant companion. He felt it, but it wasn't directed at the girl on the bench. It was for Croft, for the casual cruelty of a man who used people like chess pieces, and in that moment, watching her weep in the biting cold, he felt something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time, a dull, aching sense of responsibility. She was a part of Croft's trap, but she wasn't the trap itself. She was just another victim. He pushed off from the post he'd been leaning against, the crunch of his boots on the snow-covered planks silencing the nearby whispers. He walked towards the bench, his long coat shielding him from the worst of the wind. Croft's men tensed, but Caleb ignored them. He stopped in front of the girl. She didn't look up. "Are you May?" he asked. His voice was rough from disuse and the cold. The girl flinched, her head snapping up. Her eyes were wide with fear, red-rimmed from crying. She was younger than he'd thought, 18 maybe. Her face was smudged with soot from the train, her black hair pulled back in a simple, severe knot. The town gossips would call her plain, foreign, ugly. Caleb saw a child trying to be brave in a world that had offered her no kindness. She gave a small, jerky nod. He took a breath, the frozen air burning his lungs. This was it, the moment he either accepted the yoke or fought it and likely died. But looking at her, he knew he couldn't turn his back. That would be Croft's victory. Leaving her here to the mercy of this town would be a cruelty he couldn't stomach. "I'm Caleb Thorne," he said, his voice softer this time. "I'm the one you were sent to meet." Her eyes searched his face, looking for the malice she must have been expecting. He kept his expression neutral, offering her nothing but the simple truth of his presence. He reached down, his gloved hand closing around the handle of her suitcase. It was lighter than it looked. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you out of this cold." He offered her his arm. It was a formal, almost courtly gesture, and it was a direct challenge to the sneering men who watched. For a long moment she just stared at his arm as if she didn't understand. Then, hesitantly, she placed her small, cold hand on his sleeve. Her touch was barely there, a ghost of a thing. He curled his arm, drawing her to her feet. As he led her away from the station and towards the wagon he'd borrowed, he felt the weight of every stare on his back. The joke had been delivered. But Caleb Thorne was not laughing. He had a wife, and Jedediah Croft had a problem. The game was just beginning. The ceremony, if it could be called that, took place in the corner of Croft's saloon. The place reeked of stale beer and wet wool. Jedediah Croft himself presided, a self-satisfied smile playing on his lips. He'd procured a circuit preacher who was more drunk than pious, the man's words slurring together as he read from a worn Bible. The room was filled with onlookers, men who worked for Croft and others who were simply there for the free whiskey and the spectacle. They stared openly at May, who stood beside Caleb, her head bowed, her hands clenched so tightly in front of her that her knuckles were white. Caleb stood rigid, his gaze fixed on a point on the wall just over Croft's shoulder. He endured the leering jokes and the slurred blessings. He felt May trembling beside him and had the absurd impulse to put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. But he didn't. They were strangers, bound by a common enemy, nothing more. When the preacher finally mumbled the words that made them man and wife, a smattering of sarcastic applause broke out. "A toast," Croft announced, raising his glass, "to Mr. and Mrs. Thorne. May they find prosperity in our humble community." The word prosperity was laced with venom. Everyone knew Caleb's small homestead was barely viable, mortgaged to the hilt to Croft's bank. Caleb didn't acknowledge the toast. He turned to May. "It's done," he said, his voice low. "We're leaving." He led her through the jeering crowd and out into the street. The snow was falling thicker now, the world turning into a swirl of white. He helped her into the wagon, then untied the reins of the sturdy mare hitched to the front. The journey to his cabin was 5 miles out of town, a lonely track that was treacherous in good weather and nearly impassable now. They rode in silence, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the soft thud of the horses' hooves in the deepening snow. May sat huddled on the bench beside him, a small, still figure wrapped in a threadbare shawl she'd pulled from her suitcase. Caleb kept his eyes on the path ahead, his jaw tight. He had played his part. He had married the girl. But the humiliation sat in his gut like a cold stone. He had never been a man to be pushed, and Croft had pushed him to the very edge. 2 miles from his cabin, the world disappeared into a whiteout. The wind howled, driving the snow horizontally, stinging their faces and blinding the horse. Caleb slowed the mare to a walk, leaning forward, trying to make out the faint outline of the trail. It was then that he heard the sharp crack, followed by a lurch that nearly threw them both from the wagon. The vehicle canted violently to the left. The mare whinnied in panic, pulling against the reins. "Whoa, girl, easy," Caleb soothed, pulling back hard. He jumped down into the knee-deep snow. Just as he'd feared. The left front wheel had hit a buried rock, and 2 of the wooden spokes had snapped clean through. They were stranded. The cabin was still miles away, and the blizzard was settling in for a long, brutal siege. A man on foot might make it. A woman in a thin dress and worn shoes would not. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up his throat. He fought it down. Panicking was a luxury he couldn't afford. He went to the mare's head, stroking her neck, calming her with low words. Then he turned to inspect the damage. The wheel was useless. Without tools, he couldn't fix it here. They were in real trouble. He looked up at May. She was watching him, her face pale but her expression surprisingly calm. He had expected tears, hysteria. Instead, her dark eyes were assessing the situation, moving from the broken wheel to the spooked horse to the swirling snow around them. "We have to unhitch the horse," he said, his voice loud to be heard over the wind. "We'll have to ride her the rest of the way. It'll be slow, but we can't stay here." She nodded, understanding. As he began to work on the complex leather harnesses, his fingers clumsy and numb with cold, she slid down from the wagon. She didn't stand by helplessly. She moved to the back of the wagon and began rummaging through its contents. Caleb had a few supplies: a sack of flour, some salted pork, and a coil of thick rope. He watched as she pulled the rope free. He thought she was bringing it to him, but instead she walked deliberately into the edge of the woods that lined the trail. She scanned the trees, then bent and picked up a thick, fallen branch about as long as her arm. She dragged it back to the wagon. Caleb stopped what he was doing, confused. "What are you doing?" he shouted over the wind. She didn't answer with words. She laid the branch against the broken spokes. Then, with a deftness that stunned him, she began to weave the rope around the branch and the remaining good spokes, her small hands moving with purpose and precision. She wasn't just wrapping it. She was tying a series of intricate interlocking knots, pulling each one tight, creating a functional, if ugly, splint for the wheel. The knots were complex, the kind a sailor or a fisherman might use, designed to hold under immense strain. Caleb stared, dumbfounded. In the middle of a blizzard, with a broken wagon and a terrified horse, this slip of a girl was calmly and competently jury-rigging a solution. He had seen her as a victim, a piece in Croft's game. He had not considered for a moment that she might be capable. Within 10 minutes, she was done. The branch was lashed so tightly to the wheel it was practically a part of it. The wheel itself was still crooked, but it looked like it might hold. She looked up at him, her face flushed from the cold and the effort. "It will be slow," she said, her voice quiet but clear, her English accented but precise. "But it should hold, if we go slow." He could only nod. He finished unhitching the mare from the wagon shafts, then rehitched her to the front so he could lead her. He helped May back onto the wagon seat. The rest of the journey was a slow, grueling crawl. Caleb walked ahead, leading the horse, his body taking the brunt of the wind. The wagon groaned and protested, the splinted wheel wobbling precariously with every turn, but it held. Every few hundred yards Caleb would glance back. May sat straight and still, her eyes fixed forward, enduring the cold without a single complaint. They finally reached the cabin as the last of the gray light was fading from the sky. It was a small, rough-hewn structure, banked with earth against the winter winds, a thin curl of smoke already rising from the chimney from the fire he had banked that morning. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. He got May inside, into the relative warmth of the single room, before tending to the horse. When he finally came back in, shaking the snow from his coat, she was standing by the stone fireplace. her hands outstretched to the small, reviving flames. The cabin was stark and masculine, furnished with only a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and shelves holding his few possessions. She looked as out of place as a songbird in a wolf's den. He closed the door, the latch falling into place with a solid thud. The sound of the howling wind was instantly muted, replaced by the crackle of the fire and the sudden, deafening silence between them. They were alone, trapped together by the storm. He looked at the woman who was now his wife, the woman who had just saved them with a piece of wood and some rope, and he understood with a chilling certainty that Jedediah Croft's joke was more complicated than he could ever have imagined. He knew her name, but he didn't know her at all. For 2 days the blizzard raged. The world outside the cabin's single window was a churning vortex of white. They were sealed in, 2 strangers sharing a space barely big enough for one. The silence between them was a living thing, thick with unspoken questions and the awkwardness of their situation. Caleb moved with a quiet deliberation, tending the fire, melting snow for water, preparing their meager meals of salted pork and hard biscuits. He gave May the single cot, taking a bedroll for himself on the floor by the hearth. He didn't ask her questions. He didn't want to push. He sensed she was like a wild creature, easily spooked. He simply created a space for her, a small pocket of warmth and safety in the storm. He watched her when he thought she wasn't looking. She was meticulously neat, folding her thin shawl just so, keeping her small corner of the room tidy. She ate what he gave her without comment, her movements economical and graceful. She was not the helpless victim he'd first seen at the station. There was a core of stillness in her, a resilience that was as plain as the determined set of her jaw. He kept thinking about the knots she had tied, the sheer practical competence of it. Where had a girl like her learned a skill like that? On the 3rd morning, they woke to a profound silence. The wind had died. The snow had stopped. Sunlight, pale and thin, streamed through the window, illuminating a world transformed, buried under a thick blanket of pristine snow. The storm was over. Caleb was preparing coffee when she finally spoke. "My father was a fisherman," she said, her voice soft in the quiet room. He turned from the fireplace, surprised. "In China?" She shook her head. "In a village south of here. After the railroad, the company moved him. The work was hard. He taught me his knots. He said a good knot is the difference between eating and starving." It was an offering, a small piece of her past, and Caleb knew he had to treat it with care. He poured 2 cups of coffee, handing one to her. Their fingers brushed, and a jolt of unexpected warmth passed between them. He sat at the table opposite her. "Why did you come here, May? To Frost Creek?" She looked down into her cup, her reflection wavering in the dark liquid. "My father, he owed a debt to a man in San Francisco, a dangerous man. My father was told this man had a business partner in Montana, a Mr. Croft. He was told Mr. Croft was a wealthy landowner looking for a wife for his associate." Her voice was flat, reciting a story she had likely told herself 1,000 times. "My father was told I would be married to a good man, with land, that the marriage would settle the debt and save our family." Caleb's blood ran cold. The sheer layered cruelty of Croft's scheme was breathtaking. "He lied," Caleb said, the words like stones in his mouth. "Croft lied to everyone." "I know that now," she said, and for the first time he heard a tremor of emotion in her voice. "When I arrived and saw the faces at the station, I knew." She stood and went to her suitcase, which sat at the foot of the cot. She opened it. The contents were sparse: another patched dress, some underthings, and a small cloth-wrapped bundle. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a faded daguerreotype in a simple wooden frame. It showed a stern-faced man and a tired-looking woman, with a younger, smiling May standing between them. Beside the photograph was a letter, the paper covered in the elegant, complex characters of Chinese script. "My family," she whispered, her finger tracing the image of her mother. "My father sent me away to save himself. He thought he was sending me to a better life. He did not know he was sending me into a cage." The word hung in the air between them. Cage. That's what this was. A cage for him. A cage for her. All for Jedediah Croft's amusement and profit. The anger that had been simmering in Caleb for weeks finally boiled over into a cold, clear rage. This wasn't just about his pride anymore. It was about the life of the young woman sitting before him, a life that had been broken and sold to settle a debt. "He will not win," Caleb said, the force of his conviction surprising even himself. "I don't know how, but we will not let him win." May looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his. He saw a flicker of something new in them, something beyond fear. It might have been hope. The breaking of the storm brought a new threat. Late that afternoon, they heard the sound of approaching horses. Caleb went to the door, his hand resting near the Colt Peacemaker he wore on his hip. 3 men sat on horseback just beyond his fence line. It was Croft's enforcers, the same men who had been at the station. Their leader, a burly man named Harker, dismounted and swaggered towards the cabin. "Croft sent us," Harker announced, not bothering with pleasantries, "to see if you 2 lovebirds survived the storm." His eyes slid past Caleb to May, who stood near the fireplace, and his lips curled into a greasy smile. "And to deliver a message. The boss is calling in your marker, Thorne. The full amount on this land. You've got 1 week to pay. $500. $500. He might as well have asked for the moon. Caleb had less than $20 to his name. The mortgage was Croft's leverage, the final turn of the screw. The marriage had been the humiliation. This was the execution. "You tell Croft he'll get his money when I have it," Caleb said, his voice level. Harker laughed. 1 week, Thorne, or we'll be back to escort you and your pretty little bride off this property. And you know how cold the nights are." He winked, a gesture of pure menace, before turning and walking back to his horse. Caleb watched them ride away, their laughter echoing in the clean, cold air. He closed the door and turned to face May. The hope he had seen in her eyes was gone, replaced by a familiar, weary resignation. Croft had them. He had trapped them in a cage, and now he was preparing to burn it to the ground. Caleb had a week to find a miracle, or they would lose everything, starting with the one thing they both desperately needed, a place to call home. 4 months later, the last of the winter snows had retreated to the high peaks, leaving the valley floor awash in the pale green of new life. The air was soft, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. Frost Creek, the stream that gave the area its name, ran high and fast with meltwater, its gurgle a constant, pleasant background noise to the work being done at Caleb's homestead. The place was transformed. A new, sturdy corral stood where a dilapidated fence had once sagged. Neat rows of tilled earth promised a summer garden, protected from deer by a wattle fence May had woven from willow branches. The cabin itself looked different, less like a temporary shelter and more like a home. There were curtains in the window, sewn from a bolt of calico May had bought with egg money, and a climbing vine was beginning to snake its way up a trellis Caleb had built against the south-facing wall. Jedediah Croft did not get his $500. He did not get the land. The miracle had not been money. It had been water. A few days after Harker's visit, as despair began to set in, May had been walking along the creek bank. She had noticed something Caleb had seen 100 times but never truly registered. In one particular bend, where the creek flowed over a series of flat, dark stones, The water never seemed to freeze as solid as it did elsewhere. Even on the coldest days, a thin channel of moving water remained. She had brought Caleb to see it. "The water is warmer here," she'd said, her observation simple and direct. Together, they had cleared the snow and broken the thin ice at the edges. A faint plume of vapor rose from the surface. It was a warm spring, bubbling up from deep within the earth and mixing with the creek water. In a land where winter meant frozen troughs and desperate cattle, a source of running water that never completely froze over was more valuable than gold. Caleb had spent 2 days in the territorial capital of Helena, poring over maps and land laws at the registrar's office. His homestead claim included the land, but water rights were a separate matter. With his last few dollars, he filed a new claim, a specific and ironclad right to the spring-fed portion of Frost Creek for the purpose of watering livestock. The clerk, a man who understood the value of such a thing, stamped the papers with a decisive thud. When Croft's week was up, Caleb met Harker not with money, but with a copy of the deed and the new water rights claim. Croft's plan had been to seize the land and sell it to a cattle consortium expanding into the valley. But without guaranteed winter water access, the land's value plummeted. The consortium wasn't interested in a property whose most valuable asset was controlled by the man being evicted. Croft was left holding a mortgage on a piece of land he couldn't profit from. His leverage was gone. Checkmated by a quiet observation and a piece of paper. The shift in the town had been gradual, but undeniable. The story of the water rights spread, as stories do in small places. The cruel joke of Caleb's marriage was replaced by a grudging respect. People saw him and May at the general store not as a broken gunslinger and his foreign bride, but as a couple who worked together, who spoke little but moved with a shared purpose. They were no longer outcasts. They were survivors. They were builders. One bright spring afternoon, Caleb stood by the new corral, watching May feed a handful of grain to the mare. The horse, which had once been a symbol of their desperate flight, now nudged May's hand gently. May laughed, a soft, clear sound that Caleb was just beginning to get used to. He had never considered what her laugh might sound like. He walked over to her, stopping at her side. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the horse. "The garden looks good," he said. "The soil is rich here," she replied. "Things want to grow." He thought about that. Things want to grow. He had come to this land to hide, to let the years wear him down until he was forgotten. He had never considered building anything, but May did. She saw the potential in the soil, the promise in the water. She saw a home where he had only seen a refuge. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were calloused from her work in the garden, strong and warm. She didn't pull away. She laced her fingers through his, her hand fitting into his as if it were made to be there. He looked at her face, truly seeing it in the clear spring light. The town had called her ugly. He saw the intelligence in her dark eyes, the quiet strength in the set of her mouth, the fine lines of determination etched by hardship. He saw the woman who had tied knots in a blizzard, who had found life in a frozen creek, who had stood by his side and turned a cage into a home. He saw the most beautiful woman he had ever known. Jedediah Croft's cruel joke had been to force him to marry a stranger. He had meant to give Caleb a burden, a mark of shame. But in that stranger, Caleb had found his perfect match. He had found the one person who didn't see him as a gunslinger to be feared or a project to be fixed, but simply as a man. And in her, he had found the one thing he thought he'd lost forever, a reason to build a life, not just endure one. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself. And thanks again for being here.